So much, Alice. Hello, everyone from New Zealand. I'm really delighted to be with you today. It's a genuine honour and a privilege, and I especially thank the organisers, especially Alice, for inviting me. It's so nice to see that more than 15 years after having a conversation with Marie Breen-Smith and Jeroen Gunning at Aberystwyth University, about the need for a more critical approach to terrorism and the war on terror, that this group that we started is still going, it's still vibrant, and it's still full of amazing scholars, I think, doing really excellent research. And I'm also really glad, and it's wonderful that you've managed to put on an event like this where we can all get together to talk about CTS, despite the differences and despite the terrible circumstances. It's lovely to see some former colleagues and former students as well. I wish I could be with you there in person and we could have a drink together, but this is what we have at the moment. So I must apologize to begin with that I don't have a fully developed paper. The pandemic, moving online with our teaching program, a lot of other stresses, as you know, kind of put paid to my hope to write a proper research paper for this session. So all I can offer really is a few preliminary thoughts about the continuing need to reflect on our ontology and broader analytical approach within CTS. And I hope that these comments will contribute to further discussions about the ongoing challenges and opportunities facing our field and how we can advance our scholarship and remain relevant. So the issue I want to discuss is the continuing tendency to disaggregate, abstract, and in a way can decontextualize phenomena that we set out to study, and some of the important things that we can sometimes miss as a consequence of this. When we started CTS, we criticized traditional terrorism studies for its tendency to essentialize terrorism, abstract it from history and context, and try and deal with it as an isolated standalone problem to be solved. So we made a plea for terrorism scholars to better historicize, contextualize, and politicize terrorism research. I just worry that those of us in CTS who focus our critique on types of terrorism or aspects of the war on terror, for example, may sometimes fall into the same general trap by abstracting and decontextualizing particular counterterrorism approaches or strategies, treating them as discrete phenomena which are amenable to a narrow singular analysis and then amenable to perhaps reforms which can help turn them into something less harmful and more effective. So my reflections on this issue were motivated by a number of things. First, I've been thinking about CTS and what we set out to do and what weaknesses and issues remain in preparation for this talk. And thinking about this and seeing all the articles and books and theses that get published under the broad CTS heading, it became clearer that for the most part we continue to do research within a broadly speaking traditional ontological IR framework. Now, I mean, as you know, ontology refers to what the thing is that we study, the basic substances, processes, or phenomena that constitute terrorism and counterterrorism in this case. As Jackson and Nexon argue, we can see two broad ontologies in international relations, what they call substantialist ontology versus relational ontology. So substantialist ontologies presume that entities, substances, phenomena, and so on exist in and of themselves prior to interaction in a kind of fixed and unchanging manner. They are like billiard balls or the particles of Newtonian physics. In particular, within this ontology, actors are viewed as being separable from their social, material, cultural, and historical contexts. Now, the problem is that this gives rise to things like Eurocentrism, whereby Europe and Anglophone actors are taken to be separate and self-reproducing entities, rather than constituted by their relations with the global South. Relational ontologies, on the other hand, suggest that processes and mechanisms give rise to both actors and their environments, and that exchanges between units are constituted. that you can't really understand a thing or an actor apart from the relationships, contexts, and processes which constitute. Now, given that terrorism studies comes largely out of international relations and observing a lot of CTS research, I worry that too much of our research continues to take place within a largely substantialist ontological framework, where agency and identity are seen to be located within the process or phenomena itself, and where the mode of analysis entails abstracting out and essentializing the actors or processes that we seek to understand. This assessment of the challenge facing CTS was further reinforced recently after I read Geroid Miller's analysis of the way in which a great deal of research into peace building, and that's the field where I now work and teach for the most part, where research into peace building fails to properly account for what he calls the global complex system within which it takes place, and how local efforts at peace building are deeply constrained by this global complex system and the social ecologies of violence they sustain. So Miller argues that rather than being mutually exclusive, violence and peace are deeply entwined in this global complex system, and often the unintended impact of the peace building is to reinforce the structural, cultural, and even direct violence of the system. So it occurred to me that a great deal of research in CTS similarly fails to account for the way in which counterterrorism and security is entwined with and maybe mutually reinforcing of political violence, terrorism, and insecurity, and how counterterrorism is historically and relationally part of this entrenched global complex system. More prosaically, a few weeks ago, I was actually listening to an episode of Desert Island Discs with George Monbiot. And in this episode, he refused to follow the rule that they usually give to their speakers, to bring along 5 objects to discuss. Because, he said, taking objects out of their context obscures the way in which they are part of complex systems, the complex systems in which they're formed and maintained. In other words, he was suggesting that it is a dangerous distortion to think that we can abstract an object or phenomenon from the system within which it has been formed and in which it functions and finds its meaning, and then try and analyze and understand it separate from that system. The corollary of this is to think about how when archaeologists find an object, say a piece of pottery or a piece of bone, they are able to reconstruct from that one object a great deal of information about the people and society that produced that object millennia ago. What materials they used, what customs they had around eating or social relations, you know, and a great many other things. And they do that through recognizing the way in which those objects are constituted by the social practices and the historical context within which it emerges. So reflecting on this, it became clear to me that it's impossible to properly understand any particular act of terrorism, any particular terrorist or terrorist group, or any particular counterterrorism program or action outside of the complex systems, context, both historical and cultural, and the social ecology within which they exist. Added to this, we need to note, as Nicole Boyven argued, that material culture, including things like technology, is also crucial to understanding human actions, processes, culture, politics, and so on. In fact, her book is called Material Cultures, Material Minds, as a way of demonstrating that we need to understand the constitutive effects of materialism and material cultures on human cognition and social action. And yet, so much of our analysis, for quite understandable reasons, involves precisely the process of isolating a particular phenomenon, disaggregating it, and then analyzing it in a non-systemic, often instrumentalist, and invariably non-materialist way. I think it's kind of telling that there are so few studies in our field which explore the material cultures of terrorism and counterterrorism, or include material factors in their analyses. A number of emerging studies on drone technology and counterterrorism are an important exception here and something to build upon. From the other side of the coin, we might therefore ask, what can we learn about our broader society, our way of life, our values, our processes, our power structures, our culture, and so on, by examining terrorism and counterterrorism from a relational ontological perspective? Now, this is not to say that all of our research has to come from the same ontological perspective or follow the same approach, nor that there isn't any excellent research within CTS which takes a relational ontological approach. Rather, it's simply to point out that there are dangers and limitations to treating terrorism and counterterrorism as its own analytic field, separate from the broader fields of politics, power, culture, and society. Such dangers include, among others, the dangers of ignoring or reifying the ongoing structural racism and continuing coloniality of contemporary states and international relations, and the danger of ignoring or reifying the violent dominatory nature and exercise of sovereign power in modern states. So, in short, I am making a plea to CTS researchers to continue to reflect on their research and to explicitly adopt relational ontologies, pay greater attention to context, deep politics, and holism, and thereby broaden and deepen CTS research. Taking a holistic approach like this would have a number of obvious analytical benefits. In the first instance, it would help to de-exceptionalize terrorism and counterterrorism. Instead of seeing terrorism and counterterrorism through a state of exception framework, it would help us to recognize how both terrorism and counterterrorism are constituted by, reflective of, and function to reify the broader systems of violence they occur within. There is, in fact, nothing exceptional about either terrorism. You know, it's a form of coercive violence that states and a great many other actors, including, you know, men in abusive domestic relationships, for example, have employed for a long time. Nor is counterterrorism exceptional. It's a commonly seen form of policing, counterinsurgency, population control, political domination, and so on. Second, a relational ontology would help to draw out the way in which terrorism and counterterrorism are not just directly related to each other, but deeply entangled with and ontologically inseparable from each other, how they are co-constitutive of each other and exist in a dynamic, interactive relationship which is shaped by and shaping of the social context they occur in. In other words, terrorism and counterterrorism cannot be fully understood in isolation from each other or the social ecology within which they are embedded. Like two sides of a single coin or two parasites in the same organism, they form part of the same dynamic relational social ecology. Interestingly, Carl Grayson's notion of the drone interface goes some way towards explicating the ways in which forms of counterterrorism bind terrorists and counter-terrorists together in a mutually constitutive social relationship, in part through the materiality of surveillance technology. And there are other interfaces between counter-terrorists and suspected terrorists which could be a deeper analysis, including things I expect like social media, the arms trade, and so on. Beyond this, adopting a relational ontology would also help to draw out the ways in which counterterrorism is always part of and constitutive of a particular social ecology of law enforcement and criminal justice systems. Here, a focus on the counterterrorism milieu, field, or habitus. I mean, there are a variety of useful theoretical concepts here, and such analyses could also examine the material cultures of counterterrorism. All of this could, for example, tell us something about how law enforcement practice has been shaped by counterterrorism. For example, how police killings reflect counter-terrorist shoot-to-kill approaches, which are also rooted in a racist security imaginary. In fact, this is a broader point that CTS has made since its beginning, and yet it's still all too rare to find analyses which explicitly link the two together, or which take account of the dynamic relational aspects between terrorism and counterterrorism. For the most part, researchers tend to focus on either particular terrorist groups or some kind of counterterrorism process or method, and examine it in relative isolation, much like scientists examining particles in a laboratory. Another advantage of adopting a relational ontology would be to help uncover the ways in which terrorism and counterterrorism are deeply embedded in broader systems of racism, coloniality, and imperialism at the international as well as domestic level. This would help CTS to have a stronger and more explicit engagement with the current focus on racism in society that the Black Lives Matter movement has brought into focus. It would help CTS to uncover the ways in which counterterrorism in particular is rooted in a racist imagination and racist institutions and functions as a form of racial violence and racial domination. As a recent article in Critical Studies on Terrorism by San Gruthius demonstrates, CTS has, with few exceptions, yet to more effectively and substantially engage with critical race theory and use it as a systematic framework for the analysis of contemporary and historic forms of counterterrorism, although we are beginning to see some excellent research along these lines starting to come through. Directly related to this, a relational ontology would serve to reveal the ways in which counterterrorism and the war on terror connect North and South in a historically continuous global system of domination, coloniality, and neo-imperialism. That counterterrorism functions primarily as a mode of maintaining order, specifically the Western-dominated neoliberal patriarchal order, as scholars like Tarek Bakawi and Melinda Smith have demonstrated. In addition, it will help us better understand the global conflict system that Miller talks about. As yet, there are still relatively few analyses which link and explicate the ways in which counterterrorism functions to maintain military cooperation, the arms trade, military bases, interventions, and so on at a global level. More importantly, there are still too few analyses that center the voices of people in the South, or people of color, excluded by the dominant Eurocentric focus of IR and indeed CTS, and who bear the brunt of the harms caused by international counterterrorism. From this perspective, a relational ontology also opens us towards a more relational and socially just epistemology, an epistemology that deprivileges white, particularly male voices, for a broader set of voices, approaches, and knowledges. The final analytical benefit I want to mention here is that taking a relational approach directs us to the notion of deep politics that Sondre Lindahl talks about in his work on counterterrorism, and more specifically, the mode of violent dominatory sovereign power that states continue to rely upon. As mentioned, counterterrorism, like war and policing, is central to order and population control, and it's rooted in the wielding of violence, epistemic, structural, cultural, and direct violence, as the primary mode of creating and disciplining obedient subjects and exerting power over them. What this suggests, as I have argued elsewhere and before, is that resistance to counterterrorism, particularly from an emancipatory standpoint, has to go beyond critiquing the harms caused by poor policy. Rather, it has to extend to contesting the very nature of political power and political practice in society today. Creating racial justice, for example, will require more than institutional reform of the police or counterterrorism institutions. It will take reconfiguring the nature of power itself and the kind of politics we practice. Without going into any details here, this necessitates a serious engagement with the theory and practice of revolutionary nonviolence, which is discussed in a recent book that I've just published. As a final reflection, I believe that adopting a relational ontology within CTS has clear and obvious normative benefits, in addition to the analytical benefits I've just mentioned. It not only sensitizes us to a broader range of harms caused by counterterrorism, such as the harms caused by persistent racism, patriarchy, surveillance, and the material cultures of counterterrorism, but explicitly connects us with current anti-racist, anti-militarist, feminist, and decolonial forms of resistance. Within this, it challenges us to check our privilege and be reflexive about our research and whether it actually contributes to giving voice to the oppressed, freeing people from constraints and harms to their humanity, and enabling their agency to be fully expressed. This is a very important set of movements to be part of as we endeavour to ensure that CTS remains relevant and, most importantly, emancipatory in its outlook and standpoint. Lastly, we are normatively challenged here to ensure that our resistance to counterterrorism, or our critique of it, doesn't simply end up reinforcing or reifying the status quo and the dominant forms of sovereign power, as Peter Bloom argues in his book Beyond Power and Resistance. Rather, we must seek to expand the social limits of resistance, to envisage a world in which we don't need counterterrorism at all, in part because we don't practice forms of power based on violent domination, and maybe because we are no longer dominated by traditional Weberian states. We need to contest the very nature of power in society today, and not just the specific techniques of power that we see in things like counterterrorism. To put it a little more colloquially, I suggest that to research terrorism and counterterrorism today, we need to adopt the instincts, viewpoint, and ethos of the anthropologist or the critical sociologist, not the instincts of the lab-coated scientist. We need to approach our subject as inexorably part of a whole dynamic ecological system, something which can only be understood in its relation to and constitution by the whole, and not as an object that can be picked out from its context, deposited in a metaphorical lab, and then subjected to testing and observation. Put another way, I'm suggesting that at this moment in history, we can deepen our research, not necessarily by asking what are the effects of counterterrorism and how can we make it more effective or more ethical, but rather by asking what can counterterrorism tell us about the nature of our society, its values, politics, culture, and forms of power? And how does counterterrorism function to uphold the violent system or systems it is part of? This level of analysis will in turn empower our ability to engage in more effective resistance to the violent systems we're currently living in. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope I've offered a few points for discussion and reflections as you go on into this interesting day. Thank you.